Welcome back to the Horizon Knowledge Series. Those of you who attended last week and we had our technical difficulties, I apologize, but we're back up and running this time. As you can see, we have Sean Benson here, our host. Just some quick housekeeping items for those who've been asking about the recordings, and I'll repeat this again at the end. The recordings will be available in the next few days. We're getting them edited and with all the Horizon branding stuff, and then we're going to be uploading them to our YouTube channel. Everybody will get an email with the links to the recordings, and if you would like the presentation on top of the recordings that are available, then you can email me. My email will be at the end, and I'll repeat it again at the end of the presentation as well. You can come to me and I'll send you the PowerPoint as well as the recording. So now everybody will be asking for that. They will all be posted on the same place, like on our YouTube channel as the series continues on. And then we will hopefully have a package at the end of everything bundled together for download as well. So that's the update on the recordings. I know everybody's been asking. Thank you for your patience as well as your patience on the presentation. I know having a reschedule is hard, so we're going to get right into it. Sean, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, hi everybody. So we're going to talk about facility information models as opposed to building information models in this session, and the focus really is on Archibus and BIM, Archibus and Revit in particular, as opposed to the facility information model or the Revit model in general, because obviously there are a lot of things that you can do with these models. But the purpose of this talk really is that we have a lot of customers who are using Archibus, and they want to understand when they get their BIM model, how to incorporate that BIM model and its data into your Archibus database and workflows. So we're going to be talking about preparing models for operations. And just to introduce everybody, I'm going to show my face just for a minute here, and then I'm going to turn myself off so you don't need to see me anymore. And we'll start a few slides here. So Ian's hosting and I'm presenting. My name is Sean Benson. Today we're going to be talking about delivering FIM, not BIM, and then we do have a couple of sessions coming up in the next couple of weeks. This is really a part one out of part two BIM-based sessions. In the next session, we're going to talk about actually synchronizing your BIM model to Archibus, but today is more about what you need to do to get the model ready. So we're going to talk a little bit about the current opportunity that you have. What is FIM? You know, FIM is kind of a word that I like to use, but it's not the word that everybody uses versus BIM. And then what steps do we recommend that you prepare to get this working in Archibus? So the first thing is there's this opportunity out there. And for me, the opportunity is just a smooth integration of your BIM model into your facility management system. I've dealt with, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 customers in the past 2 or 3 years, and everyone has the same kind of story. The story is that they get a new building or a new build, and as part of that, they get a deliverable of a BIM, right, which is a building information model. And then they decide what they need to do with that BIM model and how they need to incorporate it into Archibus. And if you wait until that point that you have already received the model to incorporate it, then what you have to deal with is figuring out how to get it into your FIM system. Because when you created the model, or whoever created the model, you didn't think about that transition. And this is one of the things that's important to do, and this is the focus of today. So we're trying to get a smooth integration of your BIM model into Archibus, and that does require a little bit of preparation. So what do I mean by a facility information model? Well, first of all, I think everybody knows or has an idea of what building information modeling is. It's really a collaboration of multiple groups working on the design and construction of a building. There's often a common data environment which is used for modeling, where all of the data, all of the processes, and all of the documentation are captured and stored. A BIM model doesn't usually come in one file. It usually comes in multiple files. So, for example, the federated model is an example where you'll have multiple BIM models all connected to each other for documentation, structural, architectural systems, MEP, furnishings, thermal analysis, you name it. There's a whole series of models that go into the construction design of buildings. And in those models, you'll have things like work sets that are used to organize the individuals who are working on the models. You'll have phase construction. So everything in the model will be associated with a phase during the course of the building. And then of course you have all of your building and construction documentation, which is what the model is great at. So BIM is really about collaborating and making sure these groups are working together to build a building. What I call a facility information model goes by many different names. I mean, some people call it a record model, some people call it a building operation model, some people call it a BIM bam boom. I've heard that in different places. So, you can call it what you want, but really it's the FM model. It's what you're going to use for operations day to day. And an FM model it needs to be somewhat simplified. It's either one single model or it's a subset of these models that we talked about that are used in construction. And for an FM model, for Archibus in particular, what this means is a model where basic levels are developed that represent floors. Spaces on those floors are identified and tagged. There's furniture visible but not necessarily inserted as three-dimensional objects. There's equipment systems that are required for maintenance and operations. And then of course, this model is going to be what's synchronized with the operations. So it has to be easy to use, lightweight, and it has to work within a facility environment. And so that's a little bit different than BIM, okay? Now, there's a huge potential for BIM, and when you go look on LinkedIn or you go do your research, you're going to find all sorts of cool technology out there for what the potential for BIM is. Digital twins, AI work order and maintenance, the AI 3D glasses, whatever it is you want to look at. There's this huge potential in the construction industry for that. However, all of this is a lot of really bright lights and beautiful colors here, because when it comes to FM, the reality of what facilities management needs is a little bit different. Facilities management is really not about three-dimensional shapes and pretty pictures. It's more process oriented. It's about making sure that some set of tasks and checklists get crossed off and completed. It gives the ability of a requester to make a request to say, hey, something is broken, can you please come out and fix it? So the reality in FM still, for our customers at least, is usually about getting two-dimensional floor plans so that you can book a meeting space or look at space utilization, look at furniture layouts for a particular space, do some wayfinding. And for some of our customers who kind of get into more of Archibus, they'll even use Archibus floor plans for emergency planning, identifying where fire wardens and equipment is located, employee locations, and so on. When we talk about three-dimensional capabilities of BIM and their use in FM, at the moment it's really mostly used for equipment locations. I'm going to go to a quick demonstration. So for example, Archibus now has what they call a BIM viewer, which is using Autodesk's Tandem integration with the FM system, which allows you to, for example, look up work requests in a building, select the work request, and the system drills into the location of the building, and you can see where that equipment's located, what's around it, how high it is, do you need any special equipment to get there. And this is kind of a cool function, right? You can look at all your work requests for a building and kind of jump around that building, and it can do these types of things. But beyond that, to get the actual maintenance done or the work finished, you have to go out and do your job. You have to go out and fix the equipment, and that doesn't really necessarily mean that you have a BIM model in your pocket ready to go out and use, or you don't have any AI glasses that are going to be there helping you, because most of the people we work with don't have all of this cool technology yet in their hands to deal with. So we have to really work with what we've got currently and take advantage of some of the more basic kind of functionality. So go back to this slide here. Okay, so this is the reality that we live in with most of our customers using Archibus. Now, what you want to do when we think about facility information modeling is differentiate BIM from the facility operations, right? What I like to tell my clients is the BIM is used for commissioning. You can use whatever you get from your design and construction crews as BIM models to get the initial data that you're going to use into Archibus. It's usually a one-time transfer. So you get all this information from all these models, you transfer into Archibus one time, and once you have a lot of that data, you're done. So that's a one-time thing. And in fact, any method you want to use to do that transfer will work just fine, right? There's plenty of ways to get data into Archibus, whether it's through Excel spreadsheets or more complex spreadsheets like COBie, an XML format, or other formats that are currently being used for building information modeling. But commissioning is only one step. After commissioning, after you get all that great data out of the model into your FM system, what's left in the model that's used for FM is much less than you need from the BIM. So this is where your FIM comes in, facility information model. You want to create a model that you're going to be using for operations. Now that model is going to be synchronized daily, and it's going to be used to just update what you need for facilities management. So that means things like space changes, the floor changes, maybe identifying the location of new equipment, or if equipment changes locations, you can update that with the model and publish the results, whether it's through Autodesk's Tandem product or on your own servers to publish the two-dimensional floor plans that you're going to be using in Archibus. So there really is kind of two different phases that we're talking about, commissioning and operations. And the facility information model is what you really need to focus on for operations and synchronizing with Archibus day to day. So how do you get a facility information model? It means that not only do you have to define a building execution plan for BIM, and if you don't know what building execution plans are, make sure you look them up and do research on them, because there's some great documentation on them. But not only do you have to do one for prior to design, which is a common in BIM, but you also have to do one for facilities management. And this is where it gets rare. Many of you do not tell your design and construction teams what you want in your facility information model, or that you even want a facility information model. Many of you are just accepting what is delivered and trying to use whatever that is for operations. And that's going to make it more difficult for you to transition your BIM models into your facility systems. So for example, for commissioning for the BIM execution plan, you want to identify the data that you want in that initial transfer: equipment, manufacturer, serial numbers, installation dates, preventive maintenance schedules, the inventory of furniture, the inventory of space, all of that information that you're going to get for commissioning, you need to identify. But you also need to identify in your FM building execution plan or BIM execution plan what that data is that's going to be ongoingly synchronized in operations. So things like, what kind of space numbers are you using, the area that you need in the space, allocated space, equipment identifiers, locations of equipment, what kind of linked models are going to be using day to day. These are the types of things that you need to include in that BIM execution plan for facilities management. Now, let's say you get a model. There really is a few steps that I'm talking about specifically for doing two things. One, scrubbing and reducing a BIM that you get in order to create a facility information model, and then adding features that you might not have specified to get your final facility information model. So what I have is a series of steps that I typically go through with customers, and if we do this for any BIM model that they've received from their design and construction teams, generally speaking, the transfer of data from the model into Archibus becomes very easy, and it works like a charm. Okay, if you haven't gone through these steps, things can go wrong. Data can be mismatched. Data that Archibus is looking for might not exist, or there might be data that's been generated that doesn't match with Archibus, and so on. So you run into all these little issues because you haven't really specified that you wanted a facility information model. But if you do these two sets of steps, you'll find that whatever model you get, you should be able to fairly easily incorporate into Archibus and then keep in sync day to day, even if you didn't start with just a facility information model. So what are those steps? Well, if you get a BIM model, right, from your design and construction as a deliverable, then often what you need to do to get it organized to work with FM is first create a separate model for FM, right? So you create a detached FM model, or models if you have 2 or 3 linked models. Then go through and basically scrub it and clean it up. That means removing anything that you don't need in the model that was used for commissioning the building. So that means removing inactive links to CAD and PDF or images, remove unnecessary design items that you have in the model. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. Clean up the project browser to orient it more around facilities management rather than construction. Remove any underlays, purge all these unused elements that make the file too big. And then you have things like confirming the project base point is set to 0, 0, confirming the project north is rotated in the direction that you want to publish to Archibus or your FM system, and verify that any data that you want to pull into your database has a primary key that you can use to pull the data in and create the records in the database. So those are things that you want to do to any model that you get, just to clean it up and make it ready for operations. But then separately, there's certain data, certain types of information that you want, that Archibus or the FM system needs. And so that means that, number one, you might have to establish what we call shared parameters in the model. And again, if you don't know what those are, go look those up on Google them or something. But shared parameters are something that you're going to use to map Archibus data to your FM, to your BIM data. You want to create views of the space just like you would in AutoCAD, right? That to capture Archibus room data. You want to have You want to have views of gross areas, same because Archibus needs those gross areas for its calculations. You polyline as needed. I know polylining is not something that you're supposed to have to do with BIM, but the reality is it doesn't necessarily go away. There are still spaces that Revit can't figure out on its own, or you have standards that don't match up with the out-of-the-box Revit functions, and you'll need to actually do some polylining. And there are tools in the BIM models to do that. So there is an element of polylining that you might have to do, depending on your standards. You'll have to make sure everything is tagged properly so that you can review it and read it. You may want to simplify, three-dimensional objects, or simplify their what we call level of detail for things like furniture. You don't need three-dimensional furniture in BIM or in a facilities information model. You can get away with 2 dimensions, for example. You want to tag equipment elements, and you can even develop what we call schedules in Revit. Remember, Revit is a database and Archibus is a database, and if you want to ever compare the two, you can create views of the data that you can map to each other and look at and compare. So there's this nice feature in Revit for basically creating reports of your rooms and equipment and furniture and everything else. And then lastly, of course, you want to configure publishing so that what you push into Archibus or push into Autodesk Tandem product is exactly what you want to see in your operations system. So this is a lot to kind of take in, I think, if you haven't actually worked with the BIM model yet. But let me actually show you a couple examples of what I mean by the BIM model versus the facility information model. So I'm going to hop in here to Revit. So this is a Revit model. This is an example of what I would call a nice, easy Archibus facility information model. And what I have to compare this to is another model, which is a typical BIM model that you'll receive from construction. And we'll just look at the difference now, okay? If you look at this Archibus facility information model, it's still just a Revit file like the other one. What you see are some basic clean floor plans, ceiling plans, 3-dimensional views, elevations, and area plans used to capture the space on floors. So you'll see what I mean in just a minute, but this is a very simplified view of a BIM model. So I can click on, for example, a 3-dimensional view. I can see the building. If I click on, for example, a floor number 2, it's going to show me a floor plan. And even I've got, in this particular case, I've created floor plans that are specifically designed to show rooms and room areas and allocations and so on. In addition to that, I've got gross building area plans. So I have what Archibus would call an external gross building area, which I think is just here for that same floor, right? I've got a whole gross area mapped out, and I can easily link that to Archibus later on. Same thing for the interior areas. I've got interior gross areas mapped out as well, and that's here in the Revit model. So this is a very clean model, and it's very easy to identify how you're going to map this to an Archibus data tables, right? In addition to that, I talked about schedules. You'll see that down below there are these schedules. Well, if we look at the room schedule, I'll show you what I mean by kind of mapping to an Archibus view. Typically in Archibus, you'll have a view of your rooms data table, and if you compare the two, for example, if you set up your view in Archibus and your view in Revit to look similar, you can actually very easily compare the two and just see if there's anything that's different about them. For example, in a Revit model, Revit will tell you if there are spaces that used to exist that no longer exist in the model, and that might be a duplicate, for example. So that's quite easy to see. That'll tell you if that has been removed from the model, and that might help you clean up your Archibus data at the same time. So having these schedules is kind of a nice feature for a facility information model. But why do I show you this? And the reason why I show you this is because most of you are not going to receive a single file which is organized according to Archibus. In fact, this does not happen very, very often at all. Although a couple of weeks ago it did happen that I looked at a model and I had everything just lovely. So that was nice. But the reality is you're typically going to get a model that looks like this. And I like this because when you look at it, you realize there's a lot that goes into a building information model. There's all sorts of information that you'll typically capture. So this is a typical model. And this is not one, but this came with about 5 or 6 different Revit files that were all incorporated to do different things. This happened to be, I think the focus was the structural design. But if we look at the model here, you'll see there's no references to floor plans, floor 1, 2, and 3. There's schedules, but there's architectural drawing lists, there's area schedules, there's bird-friendly stats, there's also floor finishes, all sorts of great stuff for the building, but whether you need it for facilities operations is a totally different story. So when you look at something like this, there's a lot of information, a lot of detail that isn't necessarily needed in operations. It may be great for commissioning, it may be great for that initial data load, but it's not really going to be helping you out day to day with Archibus. So let's just take a very quick look at this guy. I mean, we've got things like question marks here for floor plans. They have detail views, sectional views, elevations, ceiling plans. These are all very typical of building information models. Then there's a whole series of three-dimensional views, construction views for doors and frames, plan details, renderings. There's all sorts of data in the project browser here, and none of it really is kind of related to Archibus yet. So what you want to do is kind of clean up this model, and there's a few steps, like I said, where you can do that. Number one, you want to grab a facility information model and create its own detached model. So when you get a BIM model like this, for example, there are typically work sets down below here that are added for different groups. There might be a main model that's being used, and so the first thing you want to do is to clean up and create a facility information model is save this as its own project, whether it's an individual project or a cloud-based project. You'll typically have to go into your options and set up, you'll set this up as a central model by itself, and then rename it to, a facility information naming convention for your Archibus buildings and floors. So step one is get this to be a kind of a separate set of files from your initial BIM models. Step two is remove any inactive links. So for example, you're going to find that there's a lot of links in Revit that were used to connect different models and different drawings. Some of them you may choose to keep and retain. Other ones you may need to kind of get rid of. So for example, if I go and manage links in this model, you'll see there are all sorts of Revit files being referenced. In some cases, you'll see IFC formats, CAD formats that were pulled in and used for the model, DWFs, point clouds, PDFs, and of course, one of the biggest hits on your PC's CPU are the images that get stored in the model, because a lot of models come with loads and loads of images, as you can see, and you don't need these images after the fact, so you can clean all these up and get rid of them. So step number two is kind of remove some of those unneeded links, then remove any unnecessary design items. So for example, all these drafting views that you'll see, the construction views for sections and renderings and so on. These are all very great for construction, but they're used very rarely for facilities management day to day. So all these things literally can be removed, deleted from this new model that you're creating. Next is actually, once you've deleted stuff you don't need, make sure you clean up that browser, because the browser is not necessarily organized the way that you want it. Now, Archibus needs to see buildings and floors. So if you look at the browser organization within Revit, you can actually choose whatever this architect's organization was, or you can choose to use all of your standard Revit categories, which Archibus is kind of set up for. So if I change this and I choose that to all, suddenly I see my floor plans, my elevations, my sections, and this is more kind of how Archibus is organized. Because when you first work with a model in Archibus, as you'll see next week, the first thing you do is you connect your levels and floors to Archibus floors in the database. So making sure that you set up your project browser in a way that Archibus will work with, in the way that your space planners need, is going to be important. So as you go through this, you'll see you'll set up floor plans, and again, remove a lot of this and just focus in on getting some nice two-dimensional floor plans that you're going to use for the purpose of facilities. That's cleaning up the project browser. You also might want to remove underlays on each of these floors. So for example, if I go to the browser, the properties of this particular view, there's going to be some visibility and graphics that you want to set up. Now, we don't want to see all of this in a published floor plan and facilities management, so you might have to play around with the visibility of the individual objects, annotation types, analytical models, imported categories that you may need, other Revit links, and so on. So there's going to be all sorts of these additional objects that are turned on or off in the model that you might have to arrange or create templates for each of your different levels and floors. Next, you want to go into this manage. This manage ribbon is really quite nice, but because it allows you to go in and do quite a bit of cleaning, really. So, for example, there's a function called purged unused elements. This can be very useful because during construction and design, these guys add a lot of different kind of functions to the model. So, purging unused elements is a useful feature. I think I accidentally clicked on that guy. I hope it's not going to go and do that now. But anyway. It will help you go in and purge out all of the stuff that's not really needed. The other thing you want to do here is make sure that you confirm your project base points and your project north. So there's a couple project location options here. You want to make sure that your base point is right on the model. We had one customer who had their base point about 5 kilometers away from the actual model itself, and when they published to Archibus, they couldn't see it because it was a dot on the screen, because the dot was so far away from the base point. Archibus was trying to publish the entire 5 kilometers of distance, so it was tough to work through and figure out. But if you get your base point at 0, 0, and your building is sitting right there, you're going to have a nicely published model for Archibus. Same thing for project. There are 2 different types of north in the Revit model that you should be aware of. True north, of course, is where you're used to orient the model to its actual location versus north, the direction. But then, of course, project north is the way that the model is going to appear on your screen, and you may want to play around with that project north to get the publishing that you want in your FIM system. So the project north rotation is important too. So there's all these little things that you want to go through to even just get the building information model ready to be a facility information model. Now, once you get to that point where everything's cleaned up, then you want to start adding, the information you need for facilities. So, for example, one of the things that you need to do is establish shared parameters. So, Archibus has a specific file. As you can see, mine is pointing to my local location. But basically, Archibus adds a whole series of data maps from its own database, the Revit database, and they use shared parameters to do that. So, when you first load Archibus for the Smart Client, by default, Archibus tries to load these parameters, but if for some reason they can't, you'll need to go in and load them. And there's literally and the shared parameters literally comes in the form of a text file that looks like this, where it kind of says, hey, we've got some parameters for rooms and equipment and everything else that we want to include in the Revit model so that you can map these parameters back to Archibus's data fields. So making sure that your Revit shared parameters file has all of the Archibus data fields that you need is important. And then, like I said, you go in and you create these views, as we saw over on our standard Archibus model. You go in and you create views specific for Archibus, like a 2-dimensional floor plan with all of the rooms mapped out and laid out nicely that you can use then to synchronize and catalog later on when you decide to connect Archibus to the model. Not just room views, but you also want to have area plans. So generally speaking, we recommend that you set up area plans to capture the Archibus external gross and internal gross areas, just like you would do in AutoCAD. And then once you create these views, if necessary, for example, I think my gross area plan is not accurate, you might need to go in and do some drawing. And that's where you have some drawing tools here that you can use for example, creating area boundaries and room boundaries and so on. So there's things like room separation lines that you can use to polyline, or area boundaries that you can draw. And there's even functionality like in the individual walls that determine whether that wall is going to be included in a room or not. So for example, both columns and room objects in Revit have a parameter called room bounding, which will determine whether that room, whether that wall is included in a room or not. So you can turn that on or off, and that again is going to help you work with the space that you need in Archibus. Then you want to make sure everything is tagged. Tagging means basically you need to also make sure that you have a tag that you can pull into Archibus. We had a client recently with which included their building and their room tags, and it made the room ID about 10 characters. And if you know Archibus has an 8-character default out of the box. So automatically that is going to be difficult to synchronize with Archibus because you're not going to be able to pull those 10-digit room numbers from Revit into an 8-digit Archibus field. So again, going through and making sure that your tags are set up correctly, your signage is, you determine what fields you're going to use for signage, and then you tag all your equipment, make sure there's the appropriate Archibus primary key included in the model. And then of course, lastly, you want to go configure some publishing options. We'll talk about those next week when we talk about synchronizing Archibus. But basically, and I know we're doing this fairly quickly, but basically the point here is when you get a BIM model, you're not necessarily going to try to use that BIM model to link to Archibus if you haven't previously set up a BIM execution plan for FM, okay? What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to this potentially requires a second contract with your BIM dealer or BIM vendor for specifically a facility information model. But we recommend that you do this. You can take your BIM models, you can scrub them, reduce them down into a very simplified version that you're going to use for operations. Add your space views, your area views, your equipment in the format that you need, the schedules if you want them, and make sure that the publishing is set up to work to Archibus. And then what you have is a facility information model that you can use for Archibus and link to Archibus for day-to-day operations. So just to very quickly summarize here, you want to identify your requirements for commissioning. That's what most people already do that. You create a BIM execution plan for the design and construction BIM models. But not only that, for operations, you need to identify the requirements for FM. And for that, you're going to develop probably a facility information or a record model that you're going to use with Archibus. And in some cases, like I said, you may even need to have a separate contract for that, FIM or FM building deliverable. The benefits to you, though, of working through this and thinking about how to create a clean model is that you're going to have a smooth integration of BIM data into FM. Because just about every client I've ever worked with who had a Revit model in Archibus, there was no problem connecting the Revit model to Archibus. The problem was that the data wasn't there. The data wasn't ready, the data wasn't cleaned and ready to go. So it took weeks and weeks of cleaning and preparation to get to that point. But once you get a nice clean model, and if you can, order it in advance, actually linking Archibus to Revit is quite simple. And you'll see that in next week when we talk about that. So as I said, today we talked about delivering a facility information model, not necessarily a building information model. Next week, we're going to talk about keeping your facility information model in sync using the extension for Revit and Archibus. So thank you, everybody. I think as usual with these Q&As, we would like to capture as many questions as you have and use the next 15 minutes or so to answer those questions. So if you could use the chat or use the question panel, you can enter those questions in chats, and Ian will now read those out, and we'll see if we can answer some of the questions that you have about facility information models in Archibus.
Yes, thank you, Sean. We do actually have one question already we've been sitting on from Joe Mick, and it's asking if this process been aligned with ISO 19650. They're very similar with different terms.
I haven't mapped it myself, no. So, but I think, but of all the research I've done and the articles I've read, I think people end up saying very similar. We are saying the same thing. We've all had the same experience of what you need to get data into your facility management system. And a lot of what I'm saying is just based on pure experience. I have people who want to do a lot with BIM models, but just aren't ready for the technology yet. They don't have headgear out in the field. They don't have mobile devices out in the field to take advantage of all the great stuff that's happening. So you end up having to decide what is it that you can actually use from the model. What kind of benefit can you get? And you end up with this kind of very simplified version. But no, I haven't looked at that specifically and tried to map what we've got here in this presentation to ISO.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, thank you. And if anybody else has any questions, just put them in the little questions bar and we can get to them. While we wait to see if there's any more questions, since you've had some people file in since, there's been questions about the recordings. They're going to be uploaded to YouTube this week, probably tomorrow. And then I'll send out an email to everybody so they can get the recordings as well as sign up for the next session. Because as you can see, they're starting to build on each other. Next one, keeping BIM in sync. So it's going to build on this, more asset management. But while we're waiting, I don't think there's any more questions, Sean. So thank you everybody for coming, and keep an eye on your inbox for the invitation for next week. And we hope to see you there. We're going to be building on this a little bit. and Sean will be back with us again. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.